Hey friends, thanks for joining. Welcome to Breville's masterclass for how to dial in the Bambino and the Bambino Plus. I'm Matt Davis, product expert for coffee with Breville. If you're tuning in for the live chat, feel free to ask questions throughout the class. We have a team of experts from Breville that are ready to answer your questions. If you're watching the on-demand version, feel free to email your questions to brevillebarista@brevilleusa.com. I'm so excited to be here. Let's make some coffee. Now, here I have two of my favorite products, the cutest espresso machines that ever did exist, the Bambino and the Bambino Plus. Now, both of these machines have a very similar architecture in terms of the internal components. However, on the outside, although they look very similar from an interface perspective, there's a lot of really key differences. So today we're going to go all through what it looks like to obviously dial in and make coffee on both of these, but really the biggest difference is how we steam milk on both of these. So one is going to be a fully manual approach, and then the Bambino Plus is going to be an automatic feature. So we'll learn how to manually and automatically steam milk. Now, before we get too carried away here, let's talk about some of the other things that we'll need today. Now, obviously we'll need coffee, but because these machines don't have a built-in grinder like some of our machines, we're going to need a grinder. Now, here today we have the Smart Grinder Pro, but just know that any grinder will do a good job, but the better the grinder, the better the coffee. So the quality of the grinder is a substantial part of the whole process, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Whatever you have today will get the job done, and as you learn more and more about coffee, feel free to improve your setup based on the grinder that accompanies your espresso machine. So both of these espresso machines come with a couple of accessories, but then I have a couple incremental ones as well. So I'm using a vacuum canister today to keep my coffee nice and fresh. So the vacuum canister is essentially just ensuring that I'm keeping as much of my CO2 from the coffee intact. So when we talk about freshness in coffee, what we're really talking about is how long has it been since the coffee was roasted. So using whole bean coffee, we do have a couple different versions when it comes to the way in which a company might broadcast freshness. So whether you're looking at a roast date, a best by date, maybe even an expiration date, just know that there is a difference. So we always prefer to look for coffee with a roast date because that gives us a ton of transparency into the actual freshness of the coffee. So if I know when the coffee was actually roasted, I have a really good idea of how much CO2 is actually in that coffee. And CO2 plays a huge part in my ability to access all of the flavor inside that coffee. Now, as we start diving in and talking about extraction and what happens inside these machines, it'll become more and more obvious that the coffee we start with plays a huge role in what we end up with and actually how water interacts with that coffee. So using a coffee that's kind of a medium to dark roast profile will be a little bit easier to play with because as you roast coffee or develop coffee in a roaster, you're changing the density, all right? So coffee starts out as a really hard seed, and the longer you roast it, it gets more brittle. So lighter roasted coffees are a little bit more difficult to extract. And when it comes to espresso, you only have about 30 seconds to access everything. So finding a coffee that's medium to dark will make it a little bit easier. Now, we don't want to go full dark because if it's too dark, it actually becomes really difficult. And when coffee is roasted too dark, a lot of those oils that are inside of the coffee bean already start to seep to the outside, and counter to what a lot of people believe, once the oil's on the outside, you actually no longer have access to it. So we want to keep the oil inside. So we don't want the coffee to be too dark. It can also be troublesome for the grinder. So starting with that, fresh coffee within 30 days, really, really great starting point. So regardless of what grinder you have, I'm going to try to help showcase how we just work with the grinder when it comes to dosing into our portafilter. So both of these machines do come with a portafilter. They're slightly different from a material perspective, a little bit of a weight difference, but for the most part, design-wise, exactly the same. So we have our portafilter, and then we have our basket. So the basket that actually goes in the portafilter is really important, and with your espresso machine, you would have received a couple different options. So let's talk about what are the differences in the baskets and why you should choose one or the other. So I'm going to use the lip of my basket to actually pry out the basket of the portafilter. Might help to get that out, and we'll just go through the differences here. So you'll have a few options. There's two different sizes, and then there's two different types. Now, when it comes to size, it's a little bit more straightforward. Literally just how much coffee you can get inside your basket, more or less. So we would refer to it as a 2 or 1 or a single or a double cup basket, right? We really like to aim for 18 to 22 grams of coffee as a recipe. And when I say recipe, I'm just referring to how much coffee and then how much water passes through that coffee. So a single basket can absolutely get the job done. However, we like to stick to the double for consistency's sake. It just provides a little bit more even extraction. So for today, I'll be using the double basket, and then we move into the different types of baskets. So I now have two baskets that look size-wise the same, and they are. But if we look on the inside and see all those little holes, they look very similar. The big difference is when we turn them around to the other side. So the back side or bottom of the baskets are the really big difference. So the single wall basket has the same hole structure inside and out. So if I hold it up to light, it'll come straight through. On the other side, this is a dual wall basket, otherwise known as a pressurized basket. Now the pressurized basket has a lot of different purposes, but let's just talk about what's actually happening here. So on the bottom, we no longer see all those little holes. We actually have an additional wall and only one hole right here in the middle where the water's being pushed through. Now, the purpose of this is to engineer back pressure, because our jobs as a home barista is to ensure that the water is flowing through the coffee in an appropriate amount of time. Because really the only thing that separates espresso from, let's say, a drip coffee maker is the addition of pressure. So because water is being pushed through the coffee, we want to ensure that it's not going through too quickly. So if I'm using fresh whole bean coffee, I can use the single wall basket and have full control of my grind size. So if I make the coffee finer or coarser, I'm essentially holding back or allowing the water to pass through more quickly by changing the grind size. And that's really what we're going to focus on. However, let's say you're using pre-ground coffee. Maybe you haven't invested in a separate grinder yet. That's totally fine. And that is where the pressurized basket is going to be really helpful, because if you're not able to get the grind size just right, maybe the water is going to be passing through too quickly. So the engineered back pressure with the help of this pressurized basket is going to help you get enough back pressure to create a good shot of espresso. And it's a really good place to start. I encourage everyone to be completely comfortable with whatever your setup is and grow into where you want to be eventually. So for today, I'm using whole bean coffee. It's fresh. I'm going to be changing my grind, so I will use the single wall basket. Again, this is the one where the whole structure is the same inside and out. All right? So I'll put the pressurized basket into one of the portafilters to use later, and we'll use the single wall basket for demonstrations today. Okay, so now we kind of have all that set up. The other accessories we have would be a knock box, really helpful for your workflow. Setting up your home coffee bar to be effective and efficient is really important. And remember, the name of the game is consistency or repeatability. So whatever we do, we want it to become muscle memory so that every time we approach our espresso machine, we don't have to think about every little thing. So create a rhythm and make it feel comfortable, all right? The knock box is just for cleanup. You can also just use your waste basket, whatever's close by, but being able to have it on the counter next to you really helps to improve that workflow. Another one, not mandatory. However, if you're wanting to really dive into coffee, understand how to change the flavors and create more consistency, a kitchen scale is really helpful. So being able to weigh how much coffee we're using, it's just a nice little tool, okay? If you're not using a scale, it's still really important to get our dose just right. And when I say dose, I'm talking about how much coffee goes in that basket. Now, to get that just right, we have a range of aiming for about 18 to 22 grams. Now, if you don't have a scale, obviously you won't be able to get that. But you can use this tool called the razor trimming tool to help get you there. And I'll help you understand how to use this in your daily workflow to get the same results. All right, let's dive in. We have fresh water, we have fresh coffee, we have everything ready to go. Both of these machines also come with tamps. The exact same thing, just again, a different material, okay? One's a little bit heavier, but they both get the job done. I also have some shot glasses. Ooh, and very important, I always like to have rags because I like to maintain a very clean work area. I worked behind the bar for a long time, and I'll tell you, having a little bit of a system for your rags goes a long way. I like to have two. One that stays dry. I actually have one on my apron. I'm gonna be using this to wipe out and keep my portafilter clean and dry. I have a secondary rag that I will have slightly damp that I'll be using to wipe down my steam wand as soon as I am done steaming. Really, really important. All right, so let's start looking at the grinder. Again, it doesn't matter what grinder you're using, but for example, I'm going to be using this grinder, which has a time system, to try to dictate how much coffee ends up in my basket in that amount of time. So right now it's set to grind for 17.8 seconds. And in that amount of time, I want to try to get around 18 or 19 grams of coffee out. To calibrate, we could either use the razor tool or the scale. So let's use both and see what that looks like. So I will take my portafilter, I'm going to place it on my scale, turn it on so that it is set to 0 with my portafilter. If I did it the other way around, I would just need to make sure that I hit the tare button, or 0, to set the scale to 0 with the portafilter. That way I'm only weighing what goes in, not the portafilter itself. Okay. I can now put my portafilter in the grinder, and I have my grind size set to 11, but again, don't worry about that. Just know we're trying to find the right grind size that allows the water to pass through in an appropriate amount of time. So I'm going to push to start. Okay, so you'll notice I have a little bit of a mound of coffee here, okay? The coffee has started to pile on top of itself in order for me to get enough coffee in there. So I'm just going to take this directly without touching anything, putting it directly onto the scale, and we can see that I have about 20 grams. So I actually have more than I need, but 20 is still a great number. It's within that 18 to 22 range that I mentioned earlier. But because these portafilters are 54 millimeter, they're a little bit smaller than per se our Oracle range, which has a 58 millimeter. These machines really thrive off of a smaller dose of 18 or 19. So even though I could keep this, I'm actually going to settle it real slightly. So just by tapping it on the counter, I could also tap it against my wrist, whatever works better for you, to allow that coffee to relax, right? What I want to try to do, and this is called distribution, what I want to do is allow the coffee to take up as much space in the basket, thus getting rid of any air pockets, because those air pockets can become channels for the water to sneak its way around. We don't want that. We want to make sure that the water stays in contact with the coffee as much as possible. So what I'm doing is I'm tapping to settle, and then I'm using my finger as a bridge across the basket. I'm not allowing my finger to go inside because I don't want to scoop or press down. I'm just coming all the way across, and then I'm sliding back and forth a little bit, and I can go north, south, east, west, however you want, to move the coffee to fill in any gaps. And then the same thing, settle, settle. Now, the more you do this, the quicker you're going to be able to do so. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time making sure it's meticulously done. You just want to make sure that it looks as if you're creating even density. That's really the whole goal here, because then I'm going to tamp this coffee, right? I'm compressing it down. And if I have more coffee on one side, when I compress it, I have uneven density. Again, water is really lazy, so it's going to look for the path of least resistance. So if I can ensure that when the water hits the coffee, it's being forced to evenly hang out with all the coffee, I'm going to end up with an even extraction. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do. Now, because I know that I overdosed on this, I'm actually going to use this opportunity to do one more without the scale and show you how to use the razor trimming tool. So what you're going to do is you're going to dose and tamp first. So we'll go ahead and get that running. So a time-based grinder is really helpful for building in that consistency because it automatically stops at the same time you tell it to. All right, so again, I have another identical portafilter with that mound of coffee. So I'm going to tap to settle. I'm going to bridge back and forth a few times to fill in those gaps. Tap a few more times. And then once I feel like everything's nice and even, I have two different baskets here. One was done with a scale, and the other one I'm going to use the razor trimming tool. Both of them, regardless of which tamp I choose, I'm just going to use this one. I'm going to tamp the exact same way, okay? Now, when I grab my tamp, I don't want to hold it like this. I don't want to hold it like this. I want to grab it like a doorknob or a flashlight. That allows me to do two things. I can now use my index and thumb as reference points, so when I come down onto my portafilter, I can actually feel the rim of the basket to make sure I'm not coming in at an angle. That's really important because I would be pushing the coffee to one side. Uneven density, right? Just keep that phrase going over and over again in your head. Even density. So if I hold it like this, I can now place it directly onto the portafilter without applying any pressure. I can use my fingers to give it a little spin to say, hey, do I feel like I'm coming perfectly perpendicular to the coffee? I'm actually going to move my portafilter onto this washcloth. Whether you're using a tamp mat or a washcloth, it's a great way to protect your portafilter and your countertop. So again, holding it like a flashlight, this allows me to keep my entire forearm directly above the portafilter, and this is just barista ergonomics, right? I don't want to be putting strain on my wrist, and even though at home you might not be making hundreds of drinks a day, it's still a really great way to create consistency. So repeating the same process over and over again the same way will make your life easier. So I know that I'm level, so now I'm ready to apply pressure. So what I'm going to do is instead of pushing, I'm actually going to use my body weight to come up on my tiptoes and just lean into the coffee. That way, I'm not trying to use my muscles to push and try to figure out how hard I pushed each time. I know that I can consistently apply the same amount of pressure every time. And don't obsess about how hard you're tamping your coffee. All you're trying to do is eliminate the air pockets, and the coffee will kind of tell you. It'll move and then it'll stop. Once you feel like the coffee is no longer pushing down, you know that you have done your job. And do it in a way that's comfortable. If you feel like you're really having to work to tamp the coffee, maybe try a different approach. All right? So I have tamped it, just leaned on it, right? I'm not sweating. You can give it a little twist if you want to kind of polish the top. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other one. Check my level, give it a tamp. All right, so both these portafilters have been tamped, they're ready to go, but what I'm going to do now is use this razor tool to figure out, do I have enough or too much coffee in this basket? So after you've tamped, what you're going to do is take the razor tool and place it into the basket. Now what's going to happen is you're either going to dig into the coffee, twist, and have excess, or you're gonna put the razor tool in and it's not gonna touch the coffee. What that means is if you have excess, that means you can add less coffee next time because you've added too much. The razor tool is precisely milled down to be like the perfect height to regulate the depth of the coffee bed to try to get you as close to 18 to 19 grams as possible. So now I can shovel off that excess coffee. You can do that as many times as you want to make it nice and clean, and then you're good to go. If you use the razor tool, I actually like to give one more tamp on top just to clean the surface a little bit. But otherwise, that's two different ways to get your dose just right, whether you're using a scale or the razor trimming tool to get your coffee just right. It's a great way to create consistency. It's a really nice, easy workflow either way. Just figure out what works for you. All right, so now that this is ready to go, let's talk about actually brewing coffee. So both of these machines, if I turn them on or wake them up, they're going to be hot almost immediately. They have what's called a thermojet heating system. So what that means is it's pulling water from the reservoir and heating it extremely quickly. So you don't have to wait for your machine to heat up. So if you just spontaneously want an espresso at 2 p.m., you don't have to wait for your machine to heat up. It's really convenient. So you'll notice that they both have really similar buttons on the left side here. Both of these machines would be referred to as volumetric espresso machines. What that means is that the 1 and 2 cup button on both machines dictate how much water is being delivered through the group head. So if I push this button, the 1 cup button, on both machines, what's happening is there's a flow meter that's going to automatically turn off once 1 ounce has passed through the machine. So for me, or the user, what we need to decide is how much water do you want to pass through your coffee grinds? Now, we've referred to a recipe a few times, and we know that the recipe is really important. We also know that we're trying to get about 18 to 19 grams of coffee into our basket. For that dose, I prefer to use the 2 cup button, because that will mean you're passing about 2 ounces of water through, and that's just a really good ratio of coffee to water. Now, if you were using the single basket, you would probably want to stick to the 1 cup button, but regardless of how much coffee you're using, just know that there's no hard set rule of which button to use. If you want a more watered down or a lungo shot, you could use the 1 cup basket, hit the 2 cup button, and you would be passing more water through the same amount of coffee. Vice versa, if you wanted a more concentrated, or let's call it a ristretto shot, you could hit the 1 cup button for the 2 cup basket. Either way, completely up to you. I encourage you to try both and see what you think. For today, let's stick to using the double basket and the 2 cup button, because this is just like a really good balanced recipe. Now, pulling a shot of espresso on both of these machines is the same. So I'm just gonna stick to the Bambino because it's closer to me. So we're gonna enter at a 45-degree angle, and we're going to tighten it until it's perpendicular to the machine. Now, I could continue to tighten it, just know that you don't need to. At this point, I can just hit the 2 cup button, and it will start brewing. I'm also going to do the same thing on the Bambino Plus, just so we have an additional shot of espresso. Now, while we're pulling our shot of espresso, we want to be paying attention to 2 things. The amount of time that it takes for the water to pass through the coffee, and the actual stream of what the water looks like while it's passing through, right? So both of these are looking really similar because we dosed them out very similarly. Perfect. So here's some reference points. We're trying to get a total double shot in about 22 to 37 seconds. We want to see the first drips at around 10 seconds. Now, anything outside of that, give or take 3 seconds, is not a game changer. But what you do want to do is taste every shot that you make and make your own opinion on whether or not that is a good shot or not. Both of these shots looked great. So you'll need to just get to know your coffee a little bit. Again, the coffee you're using is probably different than the coffee I'm using, so your results will vary. Now, if those shots are pulling too slowly, let's say you didn't see drips until 15 seconds, maybe longer. That means your grind size is too fine and you need to increase your grind size, making it more coarse. That will allow the water to pass through a little bit easier. On the flip side, if the water is coming through really quickly, let's say you start seeing drips at 7 seconds, 5 seconds, and your total shot finishes in less than 20 seconds, that means the water is passing through way too easily and you need to go more fine. And that would be the adjustment that you make to get a better shot. You'll need to play around with it a little bit. And again, regarding the grinder that you're using, your grind adjustment will be different, but try not to make huge incremental changes in one time, because then you're going to be overcompensating, kind of chasing your tail, and it'll take you a really long time to actually find a good resting spot. So 1 to 3 grind size adjustments at a time will actually get you there faster. So hopefully that helps. That's dialing in coffee on both of these machines. Now let's talk about building a beverage. So once you have a shot of espresso, you now have the base of pretty much everything. So let's say you add some hot water. You've created an Americano or a long black. You could also add milk. You could do it hot or cold. You could steam it. You could ice it. Cappuccino, latte, macchiato, whatever. It's all done with using the base of an espresso. So take your time, get the espresso right, and then let's play with making beverages using that as an ingredient. So both of these machines have steam wands, but like I said earlier, one is fully manual and one is automatic. So what we're going to do is play with both. I have 2 milk jugs and I'm going to grab some milk. Now today I'm using whole milk, but let's say you can't have whole milk or you prefer the taste of oat milk. Whatever it is you want to use, the way in which you're introducing both heat and air will be the same. Just know that if you're going back and forth between the two, you might notice a slight difference in the technique and how they receive those 2 elements. Now, using whole milk for today also because it just happens to be a really great balance of both protein and fat, and it creates really silky microfoam. But I'm not saying that you can't do it with oat milk. You totally could. What I'm going to do is fill up both of these jugs to be just below the bottom of the spout. That tends to be a really great starting volume regardless of what vessel you're pouring into, but you'll probably need to play around with a little bit to figure out how much milk you would like to use based on the beverage that you're creating. So again, my milk is just below the bottom of the spout. I wouldn't go any higher than that. Okay, now I'm going to start with the Bambino Plus because it's going to automatically hands-free steam for me, and while that's going, I'm going to start steaming on the Bambino manually. Okay, so what does it look like to steam on the Bambino Plus? Well, you have 2 options. On the top here, you'll notice you have your temperature setting. On the bottom, you have your froth setting. So think of it like the texture. How thick or light do you want your milk? Now, each one of them have 3 variations, your low, medium, and high. So for your temperature, low, medium, and high, your high will hover around 160, your low will be around 130. For your froth level, think about your low being your flat white, and then your high being your cappuccino. So play around with it again and try to figure out what suits your preference. Let's say for demonstration purposes, we'll do medium for both. So I'm going to lift up my steam wand and I'm going to ensure that my steaming pitcher rests on top of this little sensor pad. Now, what that sensor is regulating the temperature, or I guess more so reading the temperature of the bottom of my milk jug. And because I have a setting here, it needs to know when to automatically turn off. Once I have that situated in position, I can now hit the steam button. And what's going to happen is the steam wand's going to automatically be forcing air into the milk hands-free. So I can step away, make some toast, whatever, come back, and everything's gonna be ready for me. On the other side, the Bambino is more of a traditional analog approach to steaming milk. So let's talk about what that technique looks like. Well, there's two perspectives that we really need to think about here. The first one is the depth. I don't want the tip of my steam wand to be breaking the surface of my milk until I'm ready to do so. So I always like to start with it slightly submerged below the surface of the milk. Okay? I also like to use the spout of my pitcher as kind of a pivot point so that I can lock it into position and it's not going to be moving around on me too much. The other really important position is I don't want to be in the center of my jug. I want to be slightly off center. What that does is it allows me to create a whirlpool. The whirlpool is really important for making sure that I'm not just building foam on top of itself. I'm actually allowing the foam to be incorporated by mixing through the entire body of the milk. So before we get started, when we're manually steaming milk, we always want to purge out any steam that is not yet vaporized and is just hot water. So just turn on your steam wand, noting that the water is going from 200 degrees for the coffee up to about 270 degrees for the steam. So it just takes a second for it to get up there. The thermojet does it very quickly. Once you start seeing steam, you can turn it off. And now let's find our position. Using the spout, making sure that we're just below the surface of the milk and a little bit to the side. Take your time finding a position that feels comfortable. Once we're there, we can turn on the steam wand. Once you start hearing it get going, we're going to slowly pull down on our jug so that the tip of the steam wand is breaking the surface of the milk. It'll sound kind of like paper tearing, right? Now we want to do this until the outside of our pitcher feels about body temperature. Once it feels like it has reached that temperature, we're going to submerge the tip of the wand back into the jug. You'll notice my movements were really subtle. I'm not moving my jug around a whole lot. That's really important for consistency and repeatability. I still have that whirlpool going. I'm using my hand to make sure that my temperature is where I want it. And once it's too hot to touch, it's probably too hot to drink. However, if you do like it to be hotter, just remove your hand, count to 3 or 5, and then push the steam button to turn it off. Wait until you hear all that pressure dissipate. Remove the jug, immediately wipe our steam wand, place it into the drip tray, and then purge. So we purge before and after, and that'll go a long way when it comes to preventative maintenance. Now, on our automatic side, we're going to also immediately wipe our steam wand, and we're going to make sure we push back down, and the machine will actually automatically purge itself. So the exact same routine that we did manually, we are now doing automatically. Now, both of these machines created microfoam milk, but one did it automatically, one did it manually. So depending on your scenario, you're going to end up with the same product. So let's just talk about what it looks like to pour it. Now, I'm going to reach for a larger vessel here. I'm going to use one of these shots of espresso. Yes, they have been sitting for a while, but no, they have not lost their quality. You will notice that the crema might dissipate a little bit. They might cool down, but the flavor remains the same. Now I'm going to start pouring a little bit of a distance here to make sure the milk goes down to the bottom of my cup. I'm going to stop about halfway, and then I'm going to get really close and increase my pour speed. And that, my friends, is how you pour literally any drink. And if your texture is done properly, you will start to pour latte art. Now, I don't want anyone to get carried away or obsessing about what your coffee looks like, because that is not important. At one point, latte art was an accident, right? Someone got the density of their foam just right to where it happened to float to the surface. So once you get the texture right, just know that the latte art will come eventually. Otherwise, it can become a distraction because if you have the texture right, if you have a great shot of espresso, it's gonna taste fantastic. And as you can see in this vessel, we now have a little bit of a delineation to where we can actually see how much foam we created on the side of the cup. Play around with different amounts of foam to see what you prefer. Either way, have fun making coffee. I hope this was helpful. I have a blast making coffee regardless of the outcome. And don't forget, always drink your coffee. Always think about what you like. Your preference matters. And thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next time.